This slide I won't spend very much time on to get to the juicy findings, again because of the great work of many of my colleagues earlier today. If we look at development of what I call the market, being a variety of schools that exist and also a variety of costs that are generally associated with those levels, the first thing that we must acknowledge is there were differences within the educational system in the Soviet period, in the simple sense that there were gymnasiums, lyceums, schools that focused on physics and mathematics. One famous example here in Almaty, started in the 1970s, was set up as a boarding school and continues to host world international Olympiads for physics and mathematics. And so even as early as the 70s, there was definitely differentiation in the system. And parents using different ways to access these schools that maybe perhaps the elite attended or that specialized in humanitarian subjects, in social sciences or music. They were employing their different choices and abilities and leveraging those different types of opportunities. Also, we should also acknowledge that there's a couple of things that set this up. There's both economic and political decline happening, which many of you have described, and I think someone said very well, we lived through this period, so we understand what this happened. I don't need to explain it. There's also at the same time pro-market reforms coming either through the international, transnational organizations specifying different policies. So laws establishing private schools came about in the 1990s. There was also decentralization. Responsibility for funding moved from the central government on to regional governments. And also approved fees for extracurricular courses, educational services that allowed schools to collect funds in some way. So some of those things were legalized. Beforehand, Shkolny Fund had existed. Then also there were also for дополнительных уроков, or in Tajik it's Darsi Ilovagi. They were also able to collect funds. So just looking at the example of Tajikistan, the number of gymnasiums and lyceums expanding from 1992 to 2011 shows you this growth in educational choice that could be considered a market. For my data, I did field work in 2013 and started using qualitative work to begin the foundation of this project. The final sample was around 25 people, and I think it's important to discuss a little bit of the foundation of that because in some ways the number seems small, but my main focus for this project was what I called mapping the educational market, finding out what different types of schools existed and where parents sent their schools, factors associated with schooling. And because I used a method where I interviewed families about the educational histories of their children, it turned out that many children had been sent to various schools. So, for example, in one family, the oldest child had attended 5 different schools throughout his history. So in asking them about the type of schools that they attended, the factors that the family considered, and then what the different costs or differences in quality were, I gathered a lot of information even on that single family, that single child. So if we mapped out the educational histories of each of the children, it would magnify that number. But the main interest for me at that time was talking with parents who sent their children to neighborhood schools. What were their factors that influenced them to send them there? And then the array of schools that I call choice schools, whether high quality schools outside of their neighborhood or gymnasiums, lyceums, or private schools, or what I call choice schools, something that parents actively did to place their children there. In Kazakhstan, I was able, through the support from the seed grant, to conduct a national survey in January of 2015, but I built up to that. I first wanted to understand the context of how Kazakhstan was different than Tajikistan, not wanting to bring all of those assumptions here. So in 2014, I did pilot interviews in both Astana and Almaty, some of them here at Kimep with some of the colleagues. And then in January, I did a survey, the computer-aided telephone interviewing, in January of 2015 in various cities. And I'll just quickly go through the descriptive statistics. I won't describe them, but so you have a sense of who answered the survey. I have some differences here. Dominating within the sample are families from Almaty, and then we also conducted interviews via telephone in Aktobe, Karaganda, Pavlodar, Ust-Kamenogorsk, and Shymkent. Astana is absent here, mostly because the educational environment or context there is very much changing. As I did my preliminary interviews there, parents would talk about new schools opening, parents and teachers shifting to a new or different type of school. There also being lack of schools that are there. So it wasn't a mature context in which to study the development of the market. As far as the ethnic breakup in rural population or in the urban population, this is what's demonstrated here for parents who responded to my survey. And then the number of children. The majority of families only had one school child at the time of the interview, but a few were heroes with 4 school children enrolled at the time of the interview. This typology of schools, if we move to my findings, came up from my work in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, and I basically created or found that parents talked about 4 types of schools, and the qualities that differentiate these 4 types are the cost, the school quality, and the informal payments. And I would say the percentage of informal payments. So at the lowest level, we have the neighborhood schools. In terms of school costs, the overall school costs were the lowest. The school quality that was there was also fairly low. Not necessarily all neighborhood schools had enough teaching staff to cover every subject. Particularly, they were missing foreign language teachers often. Sometimes high-quality science and math teachers were missing from the neighborhood schools. Also, in terms of informal payments, the neighborhood schools collected most of their funds through these informal payments. There was the school fund that existed, but often it was a weekly occurrence that teachers would ask for additional funds. Please contribute funds for chalk, for markers, for paper, for newspapers, other things like that. Even to the extent in the winter they would collect money for heating or for helping to pay for cleaners or other things like that. So that was the majority of although the cost was the lowest, the majority of the way that they collected funds was informal. So it was a highly informal environment. The high-quality public schools were a mix between officially named gymnasiums, other schools that had been connected to other outside resources. You have very active school directors, especially during the time of the 1990s, during the different crises, who were able to mobilize resources in different ways. Some of them actively developed relationships, specifically with the Russian embassy that Olivier had described. They were authorized to bring in the school textbooks and use the curriculum. Many parents in Tajikistan viewed the Russian curriculum as higher quality, better developed for the children at that time. The Tajik textbooks were thought of as more academic. A lot of times with those history and other things like that, it was professors who wrote them, and it was difficult to access for students. So the Russian curriculum was viewed as being more established and also having kind of child development appropriate materials. And so those types of schools had higher quality. They often had a larger group of higher quality teachers in general. The costs were higher in the sense that the school fund that they would pay, perhaps it was $5 or $6 more per month than the neighborhood schools. Sometimes entrance fees were paid, etc. But there was also generally higher costs. The payments were often, less of the payments were informally collected. Because the state had legalized informal payments through extracurricular courses, many of the higher quality schools offered additional courses in mathematics or offered additional courses in computers or something interesting for the parents. And so through that mechanism, then parents were able to receive receipts, talk to an actual accountant, and pay the funds in that way. Some parents that I interviewed that were very enterprising actually looked at, sat down in some points and decided or calculated the costs that they had. And some of the parents decided that some of the costs of the low-cost private schools or high-quality public schools was about similar to the amounts that teachers were asking weekly or daily, but they wanted to see that it was actually paid to an accountant, that they could receive a receipt and whatnot with that. And so they went ahead and they would send their children on to more expensive schools. The low-cost private schools, there were many different scholars. One of the low-cost private schools would be, an example would be Hotam PV, which is a mathematics centered school. It's not very expensive, but it has very high quality education in mathematics. The students study for a good amount of time, and so that would be that type of an example. And then the elite private schools is another area. In both low-cost private schools and elite private schools, they would have a full range of teaching staff. Also, the amount of monies that are collected in an informal way are lower, and the costs then go up per each level. Thanks. In Tajikistan, in my national survey, I found basically the same type of typology that I had found before. This is the percentage of parents that report paying a different type of fee. And the numbers here will be higher than 100% because sometimes parents pay both sponsorship and the class fund or a combination in some way. And so you can see that the number of parents reporting that they pay the school class fund, that they pay in neighborhood schools, other public schools, and public gymnasiums is about 60% of parents. And then if you look at private schools, a very small amount rely on the class fund mechanism for collecting funds, and instead most of it comes through tuition and fees. I think it is worthy to note, perhaps this is because we did a phone survey, we do have a high percentage of people in all public schools, 30% of parents reporting that they pay no funds at all in Kazakhstan. So it's worth further evidence, further interviews to find out whether this is more related to people not wanting to divulge information on the telephone with a stranger, or whether these represent adequate numbers as well. If we then get to the exact factors that parents are considering, in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, we have a mix between parents looking at curriculum, teachers, and location. And the differences in what they're looking at in each of these areas can be looked at below. So this is survey data from Kazakhstan. Due to time, I won't describe the differences in the families. You could look just at the bars. I was interested in families who were actively making a choice, which would be these two lighter categories, sending their children to different schools, versus families who only had one child, or families who sent all their children to the same school. So I guess I did describe it. But the factors that they thought were most important, you can see location is very high, especially for the families not active in making choices. But location is less important for the families actively making choices, sending their children to different schools. And instead, what's important to them is curriculum, the types of programs that are offered for those groups. And in both groups, teachers become very important factors that they're looking at. One of the things that I did in my survey was more of an investigation into location. There was an interesting study in Detroit that first asked parents in the summer, where would you like to send your children? And they also mapped the schools that were available to the families. And then they visited the families again in September and asked what type of school they were at. So here, these are the types of schools available to families. We have neighborhood schools, then gymnasiums or lyceums or private schools. And neighborhood was defined by 1 kilometer. And we can see that in parents that were active in sending their schools to what we would call choice schools, most of them had access to them within 1 kilometer of their home. So the numbers for parents who are sending their children to gymnasium are very high, that they have access to that school close to them. And also attending private school is also very high, that they have that access close to their home. Now, that could be for a couple of reasons. Some parents in interviews did specifically say that they chose a home or a new apartment near to a prestigious school. Others, it could also be just an aspect of geography of where parents look at. From my interviews in Tajikistan, one of the primary quotes about location was that parents first look around what is within their territory, within their neighborhood, and then they decide what schools they would send children to after that. I'll just fast forward to my... I did want to address costs. Any parent here, any family member would have seen that in my earlier section of what parents considered costs was missing. Costs came up in some ways a little bit of a hidden way. Parents, when I asked them, what did you consider when you considered schools, they discussed curriculum, teachers, and location, but didn't mention costs. And part of that is, in my opinion, that a lot of it is reliant on the informal system. So parents, when they're beginning schools, might not have a full understanding of exactly the number of costs. They can't go to the school and say, okay, what are these costs? What will it be? Because it's usually after they gather during the first parents committee meeting that they then say, okay, so everyone should donate this amount or those types of things. and so it's a little bit in the background. But parents definitely make choices on what their perceived costs are. They don't choose schools that they think are too expensive for them. They usually choose schools safely in their range. In Kazakhstan, from the survey, you'll notice for cost, very small percentage of families said they considered cost. So in my last summary, I'll just say, obviously parents are sharing a lot of the same concerns, both in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. They're looking at location, teachers, curriculum. I didn't get a chance to say that the preference is mostly for mathematics or science. In Tajik, it's called fani dakik, even these hard areas of study, and language of study is also important. So I look forward to your questions and comments.